I have to think back about what I've been actually writing lately. It all blends together these days.
I know.
Okay.
Hey, everybody out there, as people come in, participants are dropping in now. We're going to get started in a few minutes. It's 6:57 here, and we'll get started right about 7. So, Nance, I've got this new house.
Yeah.
And today we had turkey, pheasants, and deer.
No way.
Yes.
You have like your own petting zoo. What? It's like the start of your own petting zoo.
Yeah, exactly. Green acres. It's pretty much.
As you said, do you not get a lot of animals normally?
Not in New York.
Fair. Okay, that's a fair point.
No, we just bought the place, so we're just getting used to it. It's out in the country a little bit. So,
how did the cats like the new friends?
Oh, they love them. They are totally fascinated by the front doors, which are actually behind me. You can see them now, but like you can see down the hillside during the day, they just go crazy watching the animals go by. A lot of lobbying for being let out.
It seems like it would be fun now. However,
exactly.
They get outside.
In a month, you might miss us.
John, our stickers came in for our club. So they came like this. So I have to cut them individually, and the line to cut them is about this big. Yeah. So, oh.
They look great.
Yeah, they're pretty cool. Put them on water bottles and laptops.
I'm just gonna send them. Oops, that was just a panelist. Folks, we're going to get started in just a minute here. Just hang on with us. We're just going to let it get to 7 o'clock and let anybody who's straggling at this point jump in. Okay. Thanks to everybody for joining us tonight. We're hijacking the Penn State, the Belisario College Journalism Forum webinar format here for a joint meeting of the Association for Women in Sports Media at Penn State, awesome, and the Associated Press Sports Editors. And the reason we're doing that is that we have as our guest USA Today sports columnist Nancy Armour, who's been a strong advocate for women in the sports industry and an award-winning columnist. Just real quick on bio, Nancy is a graduate of Marquette University and is from Milwaukee, and she has been honored by Marquette and has won a closet full of awards in her career, and including the John Curley Center Award for coverage, excellent coverage of youth sports. which was actually a serious topic. It was about coaches who abuse their athletes, and we can talk a little bit about that later. But so there we go. But a great career, and she's really does a lot of things. Does enterprise writing, and she does 3 columns a week. And this summer created a podcast, and I thought that maybe that's where we would start tonight, Nancy. Welcome, and what you've been working on. Can you tell us a little bit about the podcast and anything else you've been up to lately?
Sure. First of all, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to talk with you all, even if it's remote. So we started a podcast. I think my boss first talked to me about it in late January, early February of the year. And it was actually one of our sponsors, Amway, had come to us. Amway's a longtime sponsor of the football coaches poll. And so I had done an event with them almost 2 years ago at this point, on basically women in leadership and kind of tying that to sports. And they said, we'd really like to do a podcast along those same themes. Would you all be interested? And when my boss said that to me, I said, yeah, I mean, of course, with the caveat that we got to kind of define what it was. There was no other edit, like it was our editorial control. It wasn't anybody telling us what to do. And they said, yeah, go for it. Go run with it. And so looking around, there really weren't a lot of podcasts devoted to women in sports, which I say that with a little bit of surprise in my voice, and I shouldn't be because of, the fact that women still don't have a huge space in sports media. But it was kind of cool because we got to create really what we wanted to. And we started out thinking that we wanted to focus on women who have used their positions in sports, whether it's their role using it as advocates, but basically pushing women forward or advancing equality in society through sports. And we tried to be intentional in terms of, talking with younger women, older women, coaches, athletes, women of color, LGBTQ community. We tried to cover a lot of bases, and we ended up, I think, with 9 episodes for the first season. We wrapped them up right before the football season was supposed to start. It obviously got pushed back a little bit. So that ran for about a month in June/July. And we're waiting to hear now if we get a second season. We're hopeful, but you never know because of COVID. So that took up a lot of time early on in the pandemic, which was kind of fun because I was at home, not traveling. So it gave me, a lot of things to do. Most recently, I do a lot of work with the NFL. Normally I would be at a game pretty much every weekend, and obviously that's not the case this year. So doing stories on, how the NFL is handling COVID. It seems as if pretty much every day we're hearing that a team has shut down its facility or somebody's tested positive, and how they're managing it. And it's really been fascinating because my first thought was, okay, yeah, they'll start the season. There's no way that they're going to finish it. And I now actually think that they probably will. It might end up being a little bit of, I described it like a big Jenga game last week. And there will be some challenges, but I think I don't want to say they've got it figured out, but I think that they're handling it the right way. And then obviously doing stories ahead of the election. We have seen athletes be more engaged in the voting process than I can ever remember. And in the past, we would see an athlete here or there talk about voting or encouraging people to vote, but this is very much a coordinated, cohesive effort, not just in one league. It's across, LeBron James has a group that has athletes from the NBA, the WNBA, Major League Soccer, the National Women's Soccer League. I believe there might be one or two baseball players. I'm not positive. You all at Penn State have probably seen this, voter registration efforts on college campuses, especially with college athletes being first-time voters. It's huge. So we're taking a look at that on a couple different levels. And so that's pretty much what I've been working on the last couple of weeks.
And you did a big, you did a big enterprise piece on the difference in political giving between athletes and ownership at the major league level.
Yeah, I'd forgotten about that one. Yeah, we took a look at, one of the things that we have, a stat that we've used often when talking about the NFL, particularly with President Trump going after NFL athletes who have protested, is the fact that there were, I believe, 6 owners at the time, one has since passed away, but who gave $1 million or more to either Trump's inaugural committee or his campaign in 2016. So, the natural follow-up is, what does that look like 4 years later? As particularly when it comes to NFL owners who, like I said, President Trump has been very critical of the NFL and of its players. And so my colleague, Tom Shad, pulled all the numbers together and he crunched them, which is a good thing because nobody wants me doing math. And we did it across the NFL, NBA, WNBA, hockey, baseball, and I think that was it. I can't remember if we had the 2 soccer leagues in there or not. But the results were pretty much as we kind of expected them to be, that the majority of the money that owners were giving was going to President Trump. In terms of numbers, there were more owners who had donated to Joe Biden, but the dollar amounts were much smaller. So you'd have, somebody giving maybe $1,000 or $10,000, as opposed to Woody Johnson, who's now the ambassador to the UK, gave like 1.4 million or some obscene amount to President Trump. So, it's kind of fascinating to look at that and just see, you compare and contrast that to the athletes who might not be giving money, but they are doing grassroots work, as opposed to the owners who are giving money, the theory being that they're hoping that it'll translate into influence down the road.
Sure. Let me just ask, I'll bring in my student colleagues here in a sec, but let me just ask about, that's 3 pretty different platforms if you think about enterprise as a different platform from writing a column. Mm-hmm. So, when you're wearing the podcast host hat versus enterprise versus columns, can you tell us anything about the difference in your take as you approach those kinds of stories?
I think the most obvious difference, or the most immediate difference, is if I'm working on an enterprise story, it doesn't have my voice in it. It is, it's strictly facts, figures, who did, who, what, when, where, how, why, the 5 W's and H. So it's straight out reporting. Whereas with columns, obviously it's my opinion. As I like to tell people who email me, I am a columnist. It is literally my job to give you my opinion on something or my analysis on something. And the podcast was a little bit almost like a hybrid of both, because in some cases we were trying to provide information. One of the episodes was on Chelsea Wolfe, who is a trans BMX rider. If she makes the US cycling team for Tokyo next summer, she would be possibly the first openly trans athlete to compete at an Olympic Games. If not the first, one of the first. There are like 2 other women, one from Brazil and one from, I want to say, New Zealand, who could also be at the Games. So we talked a lot about just the whole process. How would she qualify? What were the steps that she had to go through to compete as a trans athlete? So it was informative. But then there's also, a lot of the conversations, especially toward the end of the season, got into, the protests over police brutality against people of color. We got into the WNBA's activism, the U.S. women's soccer team's activism. So it kind of straddled both lines of being informative, but also, I don't know if you want to say my take, but opinions or me steering the conversation in ways that I find interesting or toward topics that I care about.
Okay, cool. I'm going to bring in my friends here, Megan Harrison and Jacob Farriot. Megan's our president of Awesome Penn State, and Jake is a leader in the APSE chapter and our sports editor at the Daily Collegian. Megan, you want to jump in and give us a couple of questions?
Sure. Okay. Hi, Nancy. So my first question for you is, you have had quite the journey covering such a large realm of sporting events pretty much all over the world, from gymnastics and now, of course, more specifically the NFL. And I know they're all so unique in their own way, but what specific game, competition, or moment that you covered was the most monumental to you?
The World Cup and the Olympics are always absolutely phenomenal. They're just incredible events to be a part of. But I think covering the World Cup in 2019 was really something, because it wasn't just, the U.S. women were a phenomenal team, but they also did that while carrying the whole question of equal pay on their backs. They had filed a lawsuit 3 months before the start of the World Cup. They knew it was going to be a focus. And even though they'd said, we had media day with them at the last week of May, I think it was, right before they left for France. And they all said, we'll talk about it today, but then we're shutting it down. We don't want to be answering questions about it every single day. And they pretty much held to that. I think there was one day there was a development in the lawsuit, and they talked about it a little bit. But for the most part, it was, we've done that. We're putting that off to the side until we get home, and then we'll deal with it. But then, but they were still knowing that they were representing that cause and representing not just themselves, but former players, future players, and really women everywhere in terms of the question of equality. And then, of course, once we were in France, we had the whole blow up with, President Trump picking on Megan Rapinoe. And, that became a huge story. And I can't imagine what that was like for her to take that on. I mean, the president of your country is calling you a horrible person while you're in the midst of the pinnacle of your career event. And to just see how they handled that, everything, just with really grace and confidence. And they were not apologetic for their confidence and for their they readily acknowledged, yeah, we're the best in the world, and we're taking on these issues at the same time. We're pretty good at all of this. And it was just really cool to see that, and to see the night of the final, after they'd won, before the trophy ceremony kicked off, there were American fans in the stadium, and they started chanting equal pay. And it was really, really cool to see kind of this movement that the women had started. And, their court case has not been successful yet, but they started a conversation, or they moved forward a conversation that is long overdue. And that frankly doesn't get traction without them doing something like they did.
Yeah, that's amazing. It had been really inspiring seeing that in person. And I know, as a woman myself, as everything was going down, it was really a monumental time in history that I think a lot of people are going to remember, and that they won too, which is awesome. This kind of goes into my next question for you. It's that, as a woman, it's probably inevitable that you've experienced sexism in this profession, whether it's been or is inappropriate comments, harassments, or questions directed towards you about being a female in this industry. This is a bit of a double-barreled question, but what has that been like, and how have you been able to work some of those difficult moments? And what is your advice for some of us young women who aspire to be in this similar profession, or, where you are today?
Yes, all of the examples that you gave, yes, I've experienced those, as has pretty much every single woman in sports. We talk amongst ourselves and compare notes, and half the time you forget about it. I can't remember what had happened earlier this year. Some awful thing happened. And so we were talking about it. And I remember being on a radio show and one of the guys asked me, he's like, has this ever happened? I'm like, yeah. And he goes down a laundry list. I'm like, oh yeah. Oh, I forgot about that. Yeah. Totally forgot about that. And you have to, I mean, it's awful and it's disgusting and so unacceptable that we have to deal with that simply because we're women in sports. But you can't let it affect you, because if you do, you can't do your job. So you let it roll off your back. If it crosses the line of being, I mean, it's all inappropriate. If it reaches a point that it prevents you from doing your job, somebody has to step in, whether it's your boss, an official with the team that you're covering, whoever it is. But otherwise, unfortunately, you have to find a way to navigate it. And one of the best things that I've found is, for me, it's having a girl gang, other women who I respect and work with, maybe they're people I've worked with in the past or have long looked up to, but just knowing that you have other people that you can reach out to and say, hey, this happened. What do I do about it? What do you recommend? And just, I mean, and don't get me wrong, it's way better than it was 20 and 30 years ago. I mean, I can't even compare what is going on now to that. But just know that the reason that people are coming after you is because they are insecure themselves, that, they feel threatened by your presence, and that has nothing to do with you and everything to do with them. And I know that that's easier said than done, but on the worst days, you've got to just keep telling yourself that.
Thank you.
There's a question coming in from a talented young writer named Kristen Jelli that sort of fits with what you guys are saying. So I'm just going to read it and then I'm going to kick it to Jake. As a woman in sports, how do you find your voice and fit, and ultimately get people to care about your opinions as a sports columnist? I know just even in my own personal life, my sports opinions are often silent when I talk to my male friends. How do you combat this on a larger scale? I mean, obviously you've found your voice, but.
That's a great question, Kristen. I don't know that I have a great answer for it. I don't write, like now I don't write anything, or I don't say anything unless I actually believe it. Whether it's writing a column and taking a controversial or a hard stance on something, I don't do it unless I actually believe in it. And I'm fortunate that my bosses don't make me, say, oh, just write this on this. They don't do that. If I tell them, no, I can't write that, I don't agree with that, or I don't feel strongly enough about that to write that, they're cool with that. They don't make me do something I'm not comfortable with. As far as people just looking past you because you are a woman and you can't possibly know anything about sports, God forbid, sarcasm goes a long way. And again, the people who are looking past you and silencing you, it's because they probably do know that you know what you're talking about, and they just don't want to acknowledge it themselves. So just, if sports is something you're passionate about, just keep doing it and keep writing about it, keep, pursuing a career in it, because you have as much right to be in that space and have your opinions and share those opinions as anybody else does.
That's awesome. Jake, what do you got for us?
Sure. So I guess my first question is, we've seen a lot of these movements that have transcended sports, you've talked about recently in the last couple of months. And when you look at sort of the sports world on the whole, obviously a lot of it is athletes of color and, Black and brown athletes make the majority of a lot of these leagues. And those are the demographics that are being hit hardest by COVID. I mean, have you ever considered the notion of like, hey, maybe we shouldn't be playing sports right now? I mean, I just know you wrote a column about Kirk Cousins and his beliefs and what he said about this. I mean, has that thought entered your mind, and how do you sort of reconcile with the fact that, hey, like there is still this global pandemic and maybe we shouldn't be doing this, but also it's my livelihood and things like that?
Sure. I find it funny anytime somebody criticizes, and it's usually the college football writers saying that we all want sports to die. And it's like, no, we are the last people who want sports to die, because if that happens, then we don't have jobs. Yeah, I mean, especially early on, when like I'm thinking particularly of the NFL when it said it was going to go ahead with the draft. And I think I even wrote this that, what's the rush? Why do we need to do a draft? That there's no reason to do it. In the back of my mind, I'm thinking we're not going to have a season. But I just thought at the time that it was a little tone deaf. And like I said, I'm pretty sure I wrote that. Wrote a column about the draft, and that would have been my opinion. And I was proven wrong. I usually hate the NFL draft. I think it's like watching paint dry. And I watched all 3 days of it because I thought it was hilarious. You saw coaches in their basements, in their living rooms, and in their offices, and you had kids running around. You had, I don't know what was going on at Mike Vrabel's house the first day, but it was refreshing. And at that point, it was second, third week of April when we were in the midst of just, we're still in the midst of awfulness, but like early on awfulness. And it was nice to have that distraction. But yeah, it's not lost on me that we are, what are we, 220,000 people are dead. And I'm going back and forth on people on Twitter about whether the Bears should fire their general manager. I mean, it's nice to have the release and the distraction, but yeah, I mean, and like I said, it seems like every single day there's an NFL player or an NFL personnel who test positive, and it's a reminder that this is a serious disease.
And, talking about the story that you did, the enterprise story, looking at, NFL and all these ownership groups donating to political parties, what prompted that? And, how do you get tips and ideas for, these investigative stories and these features? And when you're doing them, I mean, do you sometimes think or do you come in with a preconceived notion and then be like, oh, there's a smoking gun that sort of disproved my theory? Or what if there isn't a smoking gun and the story just dies? What is that like?
Oh, that happens all the time. That you have been presented a story or somebody has tipped you off to something and it turns out being not anything close to what you thought it was going to be. Trying to think, this was probably about a year ago, and it was, I've done a lot of reporting about sexual abuse in the Olympic movement, and somebody had tipped me off that there was some problems, and I can't remember which sport it was. And a coworker and I probably spent, I would say, a good month digging into this. It wasn't the only thing I was doing, but certainly, it was several weeks of making phone calls and tracking people down. And at one point I said to my coworker, I said, there's no there. And she said, no, you're right, there's not. And so we dropped the story because it was not a story. It was not what we had been told. And I don't think that the person who told us, gave us the tip, I don't think that they were, trying to pull something over on us. I just think that was their interpretation, or they'd gotten bad information. These things happen. So yes, you follow the story where it leads you, and sometimes it leads you in unexpected places, and sometimes it leads you right into a dead end. As for the idea, the specific idea on the donations enterprise, like I said, we've used that figure of the owners who had donated, the NFL owners who had donated to Trump's campaign numerous times. So it was a natural follow-up, but also too, you had the NBA owners and even some in Major League Baseball who, they weren't really given much of a choice in August when players said, we're sitting out games. We're not going to play. I hold WNBA owners off a little bit separate because the WNBA has been so strong in this movement for 4+ years now. But so you had owners, taking stands and saying racism is wrong, and we want to be the leaders in this space, and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, okay, well, you're saying that publicly. What are you doing privately? And, Federal Election Commission records are public. So we pulled all the national ones, the one, people who donated to the national campaigns. We couldn't have drilled down in the state ones. I would be curious to see what those look like, but there's just not enough hours in the day to get that story done.
Sure. Fabulous amount of opportunity cost would go into that.
Yes.
Yeah.
This is still on, by the way.
Just, going back to what you were saying about, the story where you got a tip and there was no there. With a lot of those types of stories, do you find yourself pursuing them on your own, or is it more often a tip that's presented to you that you then look into? What is that process like?
It's both. Sometimes, you'll do a story. Perfect example, I wrote, I've been working with one of my coworkers. We'd been working on a story about Darius Geis, even before he was arrested in Virginia and then dropped by the Washington football team, about his issues at LSU. And our story ran, I think it was the second week of August. And we got several tips from women saying that they wanted to talk with us or that they had heard things. And so you follow up each one of those things. And some of them, didn't pan out. They either decided that they didn't want to talk, or that their experience was not exactly what we were covering. So, you take some of those and, like I said, sometimes they pan out, sometimes they don't. And sometimes the story ideas are just my own weird curiosity, like I'll think, oh yeah, what about this? And so I'll start looking into it. Like a perfect example is, we are doing, as I mentioned, some stories ahead of the election on athletes' role in this election, what they're doing. And I saw something about Nick Nurse, the coach of the Raptors, and I said, yeah, what are they doing with Fournette? Like Americans who are playing overseas, like what are they doing about that? Because you've got, guys who play for the Raptors, obviously they're not in Toronto now, but some of the coaches are. You have all kinds of Americans who are playing in European soccer. So what does that look like? I mean, if you're playing in, I don't know, Turkey, what do you do with your ballot? Like, how do you get it? And then, can you email it? Do you have to mail it? What's the cost of that? Again, like my dumb curiosity feeds some of these things.
I'm going to kick it to Megan here in a sec. Just a quick NFL break that the Chiefs are up 23-10 in the fourth quarter on the Bills. So there we go.
My oldest nephew will be very happy. He's playing fantasy football for the first time this year, and his opponent this week has like 3 guys on the Bills. So
okay.
Very concerned earlier today.
We have a student online asking, and we'll just take a very quick answer on this. Is there any chance the Eagles can save their season?
They play in the NFC East, so anything is possible because that division is just trash.
Exactly what I was thinking. Megan, you want to help us out?
Sure. Okay, so this is just kind of a simple question. I was curious to know, but who is your role model?
Ooh, I have many of them. Christine Brennan, who's one of my coworkers now, from early on has been very helpful. Just in terms of, I saw her at an event one time and it was very clear I can say now in over my head. And so she was incredibly helpful in terms of, introducing me to people and kind of giving me the lay of the land, and telling me things that I should look out for. My former bosses at the AP, the Associated Press, John is one of them. I have some coworkers from the AP as well who saved my butt many a time. And then too, just in general, I'm so grateful to the women who came before me, and I'm so inspired by the women who have come after me, because to see the young women in this industry now is really it's just awesome. No pun intended. But to see the confidence and just the way that they carry themselves is very much a leap forward than it was, say, when I got started doing sports 15, 20 years ago. And so to see that progression is really, really, it's very cool.
Amazing. This is kind of a question about your podcast, but if you are able to continue your podcast, what are some ideas or some stories that you want to break into for the podcast?
I still want to get Megan Rapinoe on it. I was not successful in that the first season. The owners of the expansion MLS team in St. Louis, so Major League Soccer, it's a men's league. The owners, it's an entirely female ownership group, which there are a couple of those in the WNBA. You have a few female owners in the NFL. I'm thinking of like Gail Benson, Amy Adams Strunk. But this is the first group that got together and said, we want to buy a team. And they're doing it in a men's league, which to me, that is very, very cool. Let's see what else. We focus mostly on summer athletes in the first podcast because did we think? I think when we first started talking about it, we thought that there was going to be a Tokyo Olympics this year, which obviously that switched. But so I probably want to talk to some winter athletes like Michaela Schifrin, Chloe Kim, some marketing people. One of my ideal guests would be, I'd love to talk to Stella McCartney, the fashion designer, because she did the uniforms for the British team in 2012 and has gotten into the athletic wear space. And I would be curious to see like how she's done that and how that's affected everything else. So, yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Jake. Go ahead.
So, obviously with everything that's going on in sports right now, you look at, okay, for instance, the NBA and the WNBA and the strikes that they went on with holding their labor and everything like that. And, this emphasis on social justice, do you find that you've had to teach yourself new things about how to report on race, how to report on labor issues, things like that, as even just this year has progressed, let alone the last however many years?
Oh, absolutely.
And how do you go about that?
The first thing I do is listen, because clearly I don't know what it's like to be a person of color. And I've said this long before about that. I don't know what it's like to be a member of the LGBTQ community. But I can listen. And I think the most important thing we can do is when somebody from one of those communities says, this is wrong, I'm hurting, I find this offensive, we need to listen to them, because it is not my place to tell a Black man how to feel when he sees a video about, he sees the video of George Floyd. It is not my place to tell Megan Rapinoe how she should feel about, gay marriage and equality laws. It's a year and a half ago, it wasn't this season, obviously, it was last season. There was an incident at Wrigley Field, and somebody behind Doug Glanville, the ESPN broadcaster, who is a former Cub, he's Black, somebody was making the upside down okay sign. And, people were trying to dismiss it as, oh, he was just having fun. He was sending a message to his buddies. Yeah, no, let's be honest. And especially at Wrigley Field, no. And Doug Glanville wrote a response, and he didn't come right out and say, this is what it was, but he just talked about how impressed he was with the Cubs for honoring and respecting his feelings, because they tracked down the fan and they banned him for life from the ballpark. So it was also about the same time that the Cubs had called up Addison Russell, who had been suspended for domestic violence. And so I wrote a column basically saying, this is how we can't know what this fan's intentions were, but we can know how they made Doug Glanville feel, because he's told us. We don't know the ins and outs of Addison Russell's relationship, but we know what his ex-wife said. We know how women feel when sports leagues let these guys go with a wink and a nod. And, I just wrote that it's not our place to tell people how they should feel. And that's, I think, what I've tried, this is my very long-winded way of saying, that's what I've tried to do, is I can't put myself in somebody's shoes. I can be empathetic, and I hopefully am, but I can listen to people who are close to me, people who do experience this, and take their feelings or give their feelings, priority. That when they tell me that this is how they feel, when they say this is wrong, I need to honor that, because I will never know, and I can never claim to know. And I think that's where, I don't care if you're talking about sports or anything else, that's where we've kind of gotten lost along the way, is we've not listened to the people who are most directly affected.
It's a really good answer. I just kind of stepping back we've got, about 80 people on the Zoom here, and we're going to have different levels of understanding of of what you do and that sort of thing. And so I'm wondering if you can kind of take us through a week in the life of Nancy Armour during football season with COVID and without COVID. So like 2019 was like this year it's like this.
Right.
Might just be interesting for people to hear.
So a typical week, I'll do 2019 first because that's easier. A typical week would be, I would be at a game on a Sunday. Sometimes I would be at, I'm based in Chicago, so sometimes I'd be at Soldier Field, more because of who the Bears were playing than the Bears, because they were not very good last year. And then if I wasn't at Soldier Field, I would be on a plane somewhere, either flying out Saturday night or first thing Sunday morning and coming home either Sunday night. You know, if I was going to Cleveland or Cincinnati, I could fly out Sunday morning, come home Sunday night. Otherwise, I'd be flying home Monday morning. So I'd write off that game, write live off that game, and usually try and get enough for a second column that we do Monday. I'd file it at some point Monday. And then the rest of the week, I'm trying to work on projects as they come up, but just paying attention to what's going out there and being ready to react, knowing that, to a degree, I need to come up with some things, but looking around in the sports world to see what is of interest. This year, it's all over the place. I'm watching games every Sunday, which I would normally like if I'm a sports fan as well as a sports writer. So I would be watching the NFL anyway, but I'm watching it with a different eye, flipping around between games to see if anything's happening, to see if there's any kind of theme that we need to be picking up on. And then I think this year, and I'm not sure, well, it's probably a result of both. Between the election and COVID, there are a lot more issues-oriented stories and a lot more enterprise that is available to us, or that is of more immediate need, I guess I should say. And then also working on some other projects. But again, still being attuned to what is going on, whether it's with baseball or colleges or the NBA, NFL, Olympic sports, that type of thing. Just kind of trying to monitor it all and see if there's anything that needs to be weighed in on.
That's a great primer. So it's a busy life, and it involves weekend work.
Oh yeah,
for sure. But it's also rewarding. I just want to sort of hit a little bit, since you're somebody who is like really watching what's going on all the time in sports. One of the things that on the sports business side people are talking a lot about are ratings,
right?
And how ratings are down sort of across the board. The U.S. Open in tennis was way off.
Yep.
The NBA finals had really poor ratings.
Yep.
The NFL's off about 10%, which isn't that bad actually.
Right.
But baseball as well. So what's your take, if there's a take to be had or on a particular thing that's making it drop, or is it the whole family of things that we're facing right now?
I think it's a combination, but I think one overarching theme is just we're all overwhelmed. For a lot of us, it's enough just that we, do our jobs, keep our kids from running out into the street, keep your cats from going and chasing deer and turkeys, getting laundry done. And so the idea of then adding sports onto it is, it's probably not as much of a priority. And we don't want to, whatever we do in our spare time, we don't want to have to think about it. So, if you're somebody who can watch the NFL and just have it be kind of background noise, you're probably still watching it. If you're somebody who's going to, need to be tracking your fantasy, well, if you're playing fantasy, you're paying attention. But, if you're somebody who feels like you need to pay attention to these games, honestly, you're probably not going to want to do it just because it's just too much. And then I think there was, to a degree, at least I know I felt this way. There was so much on at once, and it was most of the stuff I'd forget about because it's at a weird time of the year. And then it was, okay, do I watch every single NBA game? Like I can't watch every single NBA game and every single WNBA game and every single Major League Soccer game plus NFL. Like I don't have the bandwidth to do all of it. And so I really kind of picked and chose what I watched. I watched a couple of the early round games in the NBA and WNBA, and then I watched the playoffs a little more closely. I watched the NWSL tournament. I watched most of that, but it was the only thing on at that point. Major League Soccer didn't come in until the very end. So I think there's just, like I said, there's just a lot going, there's a lot on and there's a lot going on. And so I think that contributes. And also too, there are two things, sports are communal, you all know it, that when you watch Penn State, you're probably going to watch it with your friends. You're going to, whether it's you go out somewhere or you go to somebody's house, and we're not doing that as much. And also too, the way that we consume everything these days is different. You're not watching traditional TV, or nobody's watching traditional TV as we did 10 years ago. And that is going to be the case, pandemic or no pandemic. And that's one thing that, leagues are struggling with, how to deal with that.
I think you make a really strong point about if you can't be there, there's an element in which it's just another TV show.
Yeah.
It just sort of creates heat, like, hey, did you go see the Cubs? Did you go see the White Sox? And then makes you think, oh, I haven't been to the South Side this year. I got to go down and see them.
Right.
that kind of thing.
Right. Or you haven't seen one of your closest friend, one of your friends, and they call and say, hey, do you want to go to wherever and watch whatever game? Oh yeah, great. And so you get together for 3 hours and you're watching the game. You're not really watching the game. You're hanging out. And that we're not doing that. Obviously we're not doing that anymore.
Jake? What do you got?
Yeah. So obviously, like, sort of to that end, you hear people of a certain demographic complaining about, like, oh, stick to sports and everything like that. And when you look at, the statements like Laisha Clarendon and Ciara King and like all these professional athletes are making, I mean, do you think that contributes to ratings being down, or is that sort of overblown?
I think that is completely overblown for two reasons. Number one, 4 years ago, we elected a failed businessman who is a reality TV star. So please don't tell me about sticking to sports. But also too, there's a guy, I kind of have a rotation of, I call them pen pals, that email me every once in a while. And there's a guy in Tennessee who I usually hear from him, I don't know, once every 6 months, but he was very incensed about player demonstrations a couple of years ago. And he was never going to watch the NFL again. He had season tickets. He was going to drop them, blah, blah, blah. And I heard from him earlier right after the first weekend of games, I think. He no longer watched the NFL. He had dropped his season tickets to the Titans and no longer, he kind of occasionally paid attention to them, but not really. In the rest of the NFL, he didn't pay attention at all. No lie, the day that the Titans had their first COVID case and they delayed the game against the Bills, literally within 3 minutes of the NFL announcing that, I had an email from this guy telling me, oh, I'm so glad to see that they moved the game. I think it's better for health and safety. Not sure how this is going to affect them going forward. What do you think happens if they have to, if they can't make up a game? And my response to him was just, I thought you weren't paying attention to the NFL. So yeah. So no, I don't think it has to do with social justice movements. Let me take that back. I think there's some people, yes, but the vast majority of people, no, it does not explain that.
And I mean, I was going to ask sort of to that end. I mean, do you think part of it is because these movements have become so popular and, support is on these athletes' side, now more than maybe it ever has been?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, if you look at, the thing I always go back to is if you look at Muhammad Ali in the 1960s and even into the 70s, he was loathed. He was hated. People thought he was a traitor to his country, and he couldn't box for several years because he couldn't get a license. And by the time, the 90s, he was lighting the torch at the Atlanta Olympics. When he died, he was honored as an elder statesman. People's attitudes change, and it's been interesting to see the polls. There was a poll that came out May or June, and then another one a couple months later. More than half the country now thinks that it's appropriate not just for athletes to protest, but for NFL athletes or athletes in general to kneel during the national anthem. So we've, you could see that you could tell that that's where history was going, but the fact that it's going there that quickly tells you that people recognize what's right.
Megan, hit us with something.
Okay, we've got something here. Okay. Okay, so someone who's gained significant experience in the industry. I know for many of us members and a lot of members of Awesome and members in the other club here as well, if you could share with us some of the greatest lessons that you've learned throughout the journey in sports, what would they be?
First is for any profession, be kind to people. You never know what somebody's dealing with on that day. And you also never know who you're going to run into down the road. So, if you think about popping off at somebody or think that somebody, you don't have to take the time to say hello, how are you, that type of thing, you never know when you're going to run into that person again. Be curious. Like I said, I shouldn't say half, but a lot of the stories that I end up doing, it's because, I wanted to know something. So if you want to know something, odds are there are other people out there that want to know that too. And tells you that's a story worth writing. Never be afraid to hear people out and hear other people's opinions. I as a columnist, obviously I'm writing my opinion, but I read every single email I get. I don't necessarily, they don't necessarily change my mind, but they give me things to think about and also make me re-examine my views to make sure that, or, to reinforce it. Yes, this is what I think, and this is why I think it. Don't be afraid to take chances. There will be job offers that come that, will require you to move away from your family and friends, or, you might've been in a job for 3 months and the job of a lifetime comes up. Take chances and bet on yourself, because, and I think you probably already know this, but the days of corporations being loyal to their employees, that's gone. So you need to look out for yourself first, because, if you're waiting for somebody else to do that, that's not going to happen. And just every once in a while, take a moment to look around and realize what you're doing is really, really cool. I mean, the stuff that I've gotten to see, the people I've gotten to meet is, it's all incredible, and it's all because of my job. So I'm incredibly fortunate. And of course there are days that I've got, 3 stories that I have to turn in, and, people are calling and whatever. And I'm like, but at the end of the day, I am incredibly, incredibly, incredibly fortunate, and never lose sight of that.
What about at this stage of the game, Forrest? What would you tell somebody who's 20 and is what should they be doing to prepare for a career in sports media?
The biggest thing is getting experience, and making connections are the 2 most important things. And John, cover yours for this. What you're doing in school, the grades that you're getting. I think I've had one of my very first employer ask for my transcript. I don't think anybody's cared since then. Bosses want to know, or people who are hiring want to know what you've done and what you're going to bring to the table. So get experience anywhere and everywhere you can. You guys have a great paper on campus. You've got phenomenal opportunities there, especially covering the Big Ten school. Take advantage of that. And again, network. Obviously you recognize the importance of that because you're involved in Awesome and APSE. But tap into those connections, reach out to people that, maybe you've admired their work. Maybe you saw them at a game. Don't be afraid to email them, or, hit them up on Twitter, but half the time I never see those messages. So, but, email, whatever, or if you see somebody at a game, or an event, say, hey, would you mind if I get in contact with you at some point? Because we've all been where you are. So, if I can help out somebody, or if I can, smooth path in any way that I can, of course I'm going to do that, because people did that for me.
It's a great question, or a great answer to a simple question. Kansas City just went up 26-17 on a field goal with 2 minutes to go. So Josh better get his act together if he's gonna save this one for Buffalo. Jake, you look like you've got a question.
Yeah. So, you started this podcast, obviously, and you've been a columnist now for a long time and a beat reporter and everything. How important is adaptability in this day and age? And how often do you find yourself teaching how to do new things like podcasting and, continuing to sort of make yourself marketable and indispensable?
I think that's vital, particularly, now more than ever. When I got into the business, we barely had computers. We certainly didn't have the internet. We didn't have things like podcasts. And so, yeah, you have to adapt. You've got to learn, different skills to make yourself indispensable. And also too, just, it's fun to stretch yourself. At some point you reach a point that, I don't want to say you feel like you can do your job in your sleep, but you kind of get into a routine, and you know the way that you do stories, the way that you report things. And if you're forced out of your comfort zone, and if you are forced to learn how to do new things, or if you take that on, that's great, because you're constantly learning and you're constantly growing. And, you should be wanting to do that throughout your career. Like, I don't know if you guys happen to see, but Sid Hartman, who was the columnist for the Minneapolis paper, he died yesterday at 100. He had a column in the paper yesterday. And, people joked about Sid's big, huge recorder that he would bring in everywhere, and the thing was massive. But he still, he found a way to make himself relevant in, from 1940 to 2020. And that is, that's something we should all aspire to.
And it's going out with your boots on. That's
totally
a nice way to live.
Another question. Sorry.
No, go.
As I know, obviously you don't necessarily do a ton of beat reporting these days, but the columns that you write, obviously, yes, as a columnist, they are your opinions, but do you ever worry about backlash, not from fans, but from team PR people, let's say, that if you want to cover an event down the line, they might say, I didn't like your column, so I'm not going to credential you for this. And how do you manage and deal with that?
Great
Sure.
question.
Well, and it's not just me, it's my coworkers, because a lot of times, I can think of one in particular. I wrote something very critical of the Houston Astros owner. I don't know when it was, at some point in the summer. And they were not happy, really not happy. And, my concern was, I don't care if they're mad at me, get in line, but I didn't want them taking it out on our baseball writers. And so when one of our baseball guys told me, oh yeah, so-and-so is really unhappy, I said, give him my phone number, have him call me. I'm happy to talk with him, or I'll take his phone number and I'll call him, because again, going back to something I said earlier, I don't write something unless I believe it and I have reasons to believe it. But that's part of my job too, is standing up and being willing to take the criticism. The Saints were pissed off at me when I said that they were wrong in wanting to hold their draft at a brewery that the Saints owner owned. Just the idea of it was ridiculous. But they were really unhappy about it. And I was like, fine, Sean Payton took a shot at me on Twitter, and he called up our NFL writer, and I told our NFL writer, I said, I'm happy to talk to him. I'm happy to listen to what he has to say. I'm happy to have a conversation with him, because I know I'm not always right. And again, hearing different opinions is good for me. It's part of my job, and I should be willing to do that. And if not, then I have no business doing the job that I'm doing.
Do you have any thoughts on, again, we're getting down to time here, but thoughts on interviewing? You've interviewed the tall and the small.
Literally.
Yeah, right. Yeah, jockeys and NBA centers. But some of the people online are in the early stages of their career and early stages of journalism, and are kind of getting over that initial awkwardness of talking to somebody that they don't know. Do you have any tips or advice?
Yeah, first thing is, it doesn't matter how famous this person is, they are a person just like you are. So and at some point they will be out of the spotlight because their career is going to end. So, they will be a normal person just like you are at some point too. So don't get intimidated. Come up with questions ahead of time, write them out. If that makes you more comfortable or makes you feel at ease, but trust your gut. As I said earlier, a lot of the things that I do, whether it's stories I write, questions I ask, are things that I want to know. Because like I said, I figure if I want to know it, other people do too. There are going to be other people who do too. Most of all, though, do your homework. You can, if you don't want to write down questions ahead of time, you don't have to do that. That doesn't work for everybody, but just make sure that you've done your homework. There's nothing worse or frankly more disrespectful than showing up at an interview not knowing background on the person, having a reason for talking to them, having a general theme or general ideas of things that you want to ask them. The one thing I will say is, like I said, don't be intimidated, but be respectful of them and be respectful of their time. And so just, come in prepared, but don't let anybody push you around or make you feel inferior because you're not.
That's great. That's great. What are you watching beyond how COVID plays out? And in 2 weeks, the election's going to be over. What do you? What other issues are grabbing your attention right now in the sports world?
I think two things in there of similar vein is, where do we go with this, with the athlete empowerment, whether we're talking about the social justice issues or in college, you all know this, name, image, and likeness. What, I think athletes in particular, college athletes in particular, recognize the power that they had, that they could opt out of a season. If they weren't comfortable playing, there wasn't going to be a season. And I don't think we've reached a resolution on either of those issues, where athletes go in terms of social justice and making demands on whether it's team owners or people to, care about the causes that they care about, or, college athletes saying, we want a bigger piece of the pie. And we are, we've got our scholarships, but we're generating billions and billions of dollars for you. And that doesn't seem to be quite equal. So I think, and that's kind of been all pushed to the side because of the pandemic, but those are issues that are not going away.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a really good thing to keep an eye on as you head into business and as you head into the business. And Micro, the cat, is now sticking his ear into my frame. We're coming up on 8 o'clock. So I just want to thank Megan and Jake for joining me in asking questions, and I want to thank Nancy for coming along. And we always sort of ask the advice question. Last time, I know we've asked several things about young people, but do you have any sort of touchstone advice that you give to young writers? I used to tell people to watch the booze and the hours, make sure that the bartender doesn't know your name. But one of my students then said, John, if the bartender knows my name, that doesn't make me a drunk. That makes him have a good memory.
Good response.
So what do you got?
I don't have anything that pithy or clever. I think just be open to everything. John knows the story, so he's heard me tell it before. If you had told me that this was going to be my career as I was coming out of college, I would have laughed at you. I had no designs on being a sports writer. I had no designs on being a columnist. I still didn't as of 10 years ago. So be open to opportunities. And if something scares you, if something, challenges you, it's probably a pretty good sign that you should do it, because you learn more from taking chances and stretching yourself and betting on yourself than you do from staying in the middle of the road. So, I can say that with things having worked out, but
you never regret taking the chance. You never regret taking the chance.
Yeah, exactly. So that'd be it. Like I said, not as pithy or clever.
No, it's great. It's great advice. And a good thing to remember at a moment when people are uncertain and maybe a little bit afraid. It's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. Just believe in yourself and it'll be okay. Once again, thanks to everybody. Nancy, can't thank you enough.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Nancy.
Thanks, Nancy.
Yeah. And to the members of the clubs, you'll hear from your student leaders, and we'll go from there. So good night, everybody. Thanks very much. See you later.
Thanks, John.
Bye-bye.